An official good morning, everyone. And we're still seeing people arrive, but we don't want to start too late because we've got a jam-packed program. And it's really incredible to just see everyone on the call today, just from all across the country. It's really incredible to see. So thank you so much for joining us on our webinar today. My name is Tertia Barrett, and I'm the Sales Director at DocFox. Now, on the 24th of February earlier this year, the Financial Action Task Force, known as FATF, placed South Africa on its grey list. And since then, every single citizen has had a million questions from who's FATF, what is greylisting, how did we get here, and how do we get ourselves back to our previous state? For accountable institutions, and I know we've got a lot of accountable institutions on our webinar today, the questions were a lot more specific. What does this mean for us? Will there now be enhanced scrutiny? Are our existing processes up to scratch? And more importantly, what is our role in this? What can we do to help South Africa get off the grey list? And this is why we're here today. We've got a jam-packed program, as I've mentioned, and we really will try and answer all your questions today. Our speaker today is Hawken McEwen, who is the Director of Risk and Compliance at DocFox. Now, despite his youthful appearance, and he's going to kill me for saying it, and it's his birthday today. Yes, Hawken. I can just see him going, no, Tertia, why did you tell the world? Sorry, Hawk, it's out now. Hawken has over 25 years experience in financial crime compliance, risk management, and regulatory and banking operations. Specializing in FATF and anti-money laundering, Hawken is an FSCA approved compliance officer, a FATF key individual, and an advisor to bank FATF around AML due diligence and transaction monitoring. He holds a master's from the University of Edinburgh, a PGCE from the University of Sunderland, and is a certified anti-money laundering, certified anti-money laundering specialist. And he's also a great speaker. So Hawken, thank you so much for being here today. And on that note, I'm going to hand you over to Hawken.
Thank you so much, Tertia. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I recognize a few names on the call, really, but welcome to everybody. I just hope I can live up to that introduction you gave me now. And now everyone knows it's my birthday. I'm waiting for the doorbell to go with cake being delivered. But seriously, it is a pleasure to be with you all. Before we get started, I think I'd like to spend less than a minute really just quickly running through our key points this morning. Our focus, as Tertia mentioned, is to explore South Africa's grey listing and try to cover a few of the elements that we've been asked questions around over recent weeks. We'll start right off the bat with understanding what this grey listing thing actually means to a country. As I know there's been a lot of panic and maybe confusion around it, and then we'll look at the journey we went on to receive that designation. This absolutely won't be a 101 reason South Africa is bad, rather an explanation, hopefully in plain English, of how we got to where we are. And I'll try to be sure to cover some of the key activities that happened behind the scenes that maybe you might not be aware of. Finally, I'll try and break down the findings of that latest review in terms of what we need to do to bring colour back into the lives of South Africa and who are the key parties we're really going to be relying on to deliver those actions. Now, we don't work at the FIC, the National Treasury, SARB, or even FATF, so we can't speak on their behalf, but we can try to give you our interpretation, and I hope that might give you some insight and some food for thought. Tertia mentioned it's going to be quite a packed and focused session. If you have any questions, as I said before, please do make use of that Q&A button, and our awesome teams behind the scenes are on standby, and I'll try to best answer them as we can. And hopefully we might have some time at the end to cover a couple of questions too. But let's get started. And to begin with, I think it's really important to just say we are where we are. South Africa as a country has been designated as grey listed by the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF, because we love an acronym. And I reiterate straight off the bat here, this is a designation, not a sanction. There's absolutely no legal restriction around anyone doing business with South Africa, its entities or its individuals. Rather, the country as a whole has been identified as having weaknesses in its controls around money laundering, terrorist financing, and around proliferation financing. That's tricky to say this early in the morning on only one coffee, compared to maybe the standards that are generally accepted by the majority of the developed world. And those standards are the ones that are laid out by the FATF. Despite grey listing, though, not being a sanction and there being no restrictions, the designations do and will have an impact, and arguably already are, as the rest of the world starts to be mindful that there might be higher elements of risk when dealing with South African entities and individuals. And so they'll look to take a risk-based approach around achieving a level of comfort around their engagement with the country, its businesses and its residents. In real terms, the risk didn't change overnight at the date of designation on the 24th of February. In fact, I think the risk has been there for quite some time. Rather, the 24th of February, just the date that the FATF published their findings of a review of South Africa and announced our designation based on their standards. And so really, they publicly confirmed the state of affairs to the rest of the world. And the impact of this announcement can be significant on a country. And we'll talk about some of those impacts just now, but really what can greylisting mean? Well, firstly, there can be a reduction in foreign investment, as investors might perceive the country as having an increased risk of money laundering, terrorist financing, financial related crime. And so they're sensibly trying to limit the exposure to that risk. DFM is an independent discretionary fund manager that work across JSE instruments, said recently that last year was already quite a bad year for net sales, but the pace at which foreign investors are disposing of our stocks and our bonds seems to be accelerating. And as you can see on screen, outflows have been steadily increasing over the past, and 2023 shows no signs of abating. In fact, I think we're starting to see a steeper decline since February. And perhaps that's a clear signal that there is increased negative investor sentiment since that greylisting announcement. Of course, net sales are a sign that foreign investors are effectively voting with their feet. And while I think the ongoing power outages, the lack of reform, the infrastructure problems, levels of crime and corruption have all put a lot of pressure on the country. And actually, these are some of the reasons given by the credit ratings agency S&P Global, who recently downgraded South Africa's outlook from positive to stable earlier in the month. But greylisting is only going to really add to these challenges. The impact of this reduced investment could lead to reduced economic growth and slower job creation. And that's really just going to compound the problems the country is already facing in this regard. So I think we were greylisted at arguably a rather critical point in terms of the economy. Next, though, is a potential increased cost of doing business. Compliance costs can increase for financial institutions, but also other businesses, as they might need to implement new regulations such as the FATF Amendment Act, the general law amendments, and they need to update systems, processes, documentation, and of course, training staff to ensure they remain compliant with whatever latest round of regulatory changes and requirements are there. But there are other compliance-related costs, as I said, those other countries consider as higher risk. They're going to carry out more enhanced due diligence, and even through correspondent relationships. So we're going to start to see more hoops jump through, more requests for information, more requests for supporting documentation. Also, they can gain that level of comfort that the transactional relationship they're looking to engage in within South Africa is legitimate and transparent. That means more time spent providing foreign jurisdiction customers, counterparties, correspondent firms, investors with more information and answering more questions. And that's going to take time and resource on this side, both of which are sadly not free. But individuals are also likely to be spending more time answering questions if they transact overseas, even maybe with an EFT or a SWIFT to and from South Africa. It's likely to be subject to additional reviews and maybe delays as banks try to also mitigate any potential risks. In short, I think what I'm saying is that it's just going to become a little harder and likely a little slower to do business abroad. On the screen, you'll see some research by Thomson Reuters that was around the sentiment of organizations around compliance. And it highlighted really a clear message that compliance is becoming more and more important, to the point that it will need to be formed part of a company's culture from top to bottom, really, just to help protect the firm holistically, with that pillar of compliance and risk management becoming a key element of organizational culture. The majority of firms, though, probably quite rightly expect their total compliance-related costs to increase through expanded operational requirements to meet those updated regulations and requirements. But of course, these operations need to be staffed, which brings in an expectation that the cost of attracting qualified, skilled compliance staff is also going to increase. So not surprisingly, I think almost half are looking to try and manage potentially spiraling costs and additional burden through the use of technology. But this need to do the work is perceived as non-optional. I think on the screen you can see that almost 60% of those interviewed believed their communication and interaction with supervisory bodies and regulators will only increase and become more intense. And we'll see shortly that that perception is probably fairly accurate. Bear with me while I try and do my clicking here. There we go. And that sentiment around engagement and interaction with regulators and supervisors absolutely rings true with the FATF remediation requirements we're going to talk about shortly. Things are going to become a lot stricter in the coming months. The FSCA, the FEEC, and the SARP have all confirmed that they are committed to checking compliance amongst their user groups and that they will be much more stringent on expecting standards to be met. And we've already seen very clear messaging that is effectively telling us the head teacher is about to take roll call and the exam pass mark on the up. But to mitigate all these potential negative impacts, countries that have been impacted by FATF grey or blacklisting quickly take measures to try and address those deficiencies, to improve their compliance with the FATF standards, and by doing so, work towards getting removed from that grey list and restoring their reputation. But it's not an overnight job. Mauritius managed to do it in about 2 years, but it was absolutely made a priority for them and they delivered on their promises. If we have hope of doing the same, and I understand the aim is to look at 2024-25, then we've also got to deliver. The fateful day arrived, and in 2019, the Financial Action Task Force conducted an evaluation of South Africa's anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing system. And that involved meeting with the government, regulators, supervisory bodies, and sector representatives like banks, legal fraternities, and insurers. In fact, I was in some of the meetings when I was working at a bank. The report that we got found that while South Africa had a substantial understanding of the money laundering and terror financing risk it faced, and it had taken steps to address those risks through its laws and regulations, they still identified several deficiencies in the overall system. So on the screen now, hopefully if I've done my tech right, you should be able to see a snapshot summary of the findings. It's sadly, as you can see, maybe not the sea of green we'd like it to have been. But in real terms, the FATF standards have been updated. So there was limited time to digest, let alone implement regulations, controls, and systems. But as the FATF allegedly said to our friend Chris Milan at the FIC, you get the report you deserve. That sounds very harsh, but there were still gaps, as you can see on the slide, and we were fully compliant in only 3 of the overall recommendations. Because only over the last few months have we really seen a variety of important amendments occurring within that AML CTF space as part of South Africa's continued legal fight against what was this pending potential grey listing. On the screen now, you'll see just a few of the actions that were taken. And most of these actually came into being in December last year. So 3 years after the evaluation report, or if you think about it the other way, just 2 months before the deadline. The cash reporting threshold was increased effectively from 25,000 to 50,000, and it removed the aggregation requirement, which is where lots of smaller cash amounts need to be reported if the total amount breached the threshold. And this was changed to try and reduce noise and enable the FEEC to focus on potentially higher risks and more relevant, valuable, appropriate data. Supporting this is a proposed directive that requires all accountable institutions to submit a FECA annual return that would detail their risk-based approach and summarize their client base. And again, that's to enable the FEEC to focus their resources and effort where the risk lies, taking into account that risk-based approach. This is still just a proposal and comments are being made at the moment, but I'm reasonably confident that this is going to become reality in the next couple of months. Next was really the biggest change, an update to the General Laws Act, amended in total 5 pieces of legislation in one. No mean feet, but they were incorporated into this one holistic omnibus amendment. And it impacted the Financial Intelligence Centre Act, or FICA, as most of us know it, again, another acronym, the Trust Property Control Act, the Non-Profit Organisations Act, Companies Act, and the Financial Sector Regulations Act. So 5 things got amended by one. 5 in one sounds like a shampoo. But a common theme amongst the amendments for these acts was an emphasis on beneficial ownership, understanding the control structures of companies, non-profit trusts, and highlighting the importance of identifying and verifying these individuals as a key step in combating money laundering and terrorist financing risk. Now, a beneficial owner, I'm sure most of you will know, is effectively the natural person, the warm body, who can ultimately control or who has ultimate benefit from an entity and its operations. So it really helps to understand who's actually in the driving seat of whatever relationship you're having with a customer or a client, who's actually going to benefit from an entity and its operation. If Ethical Investments Limited have a terrorist financier as a majority shareholder, I'm pretty sure that's something you'd like to know before you start working with them. But in addition to that, it also made changes to the definitions of a number of things, but including prominent and politically exposed persons under FICA, including making a specific clear distinction of persons who have connections to government-related tenders. And I'm sure you can work out why, bearing in mind the media headlines over recent years. The amendments also specifically included proliferation of financing, or the financing of those weapons of mass destruction, and that comes under the umbrella of FICA as well now. And the final change that we'll talk about, although there were a few others, was around Schedule 1 of the FICA Act. This is probably one of the most interesting, has created the most questions. The amendment significantly expands the sectors of business that are now called accountable institution. Businesses that now have to be fully compliant with FICA, which means really knowing their clients, really understanding transactions, and reporting anything suspicious through to the Financial Intelligence Centre. And this really was a major change. It's potentially bringing in an additional 55,000 new entities into the FICA fold. We can see how the country generally made real, genuine effort towards improving the level of control and compliance. And I think there was much discussion, certainly amongst my circles, but I think also generally across business and society about, have we done enough to dodge that greylisting designation? Was it too little too late? We've made a lot of noise. There's a lot of press releases, a lot of news stories around asset forfeitures and arrests of high-profile names around corruption and alleged dodgy tenders. But there still aren't any successful prosecutions. And while we had crafted a raft of new laws and regulations, and some of them are actually really well drafted, these weren't really fully implemented on the ground. And in fact, the beneficial ownership registers will only start to be ready maybe next month at SIPC, but it's still not clear how information to get into that register is collected, verified, or who can access it. Similarly, new accountable institutions are still trying to get grips with their newly found responsibilities. And while they should have been compliant from the 19th of December when the new schedule went live, they only currently have draft guidance notes to guide them, and those are still obviously subject to change post-comment before they become final guidance notes. And the recent news around asset forfeitures were mostly around maybe some of the arguably less complex cases. So then, when the time for reassessment came, February 2023, the FATF wanted to hear what we had to say. And I know throughout those plenaries in Europe, various key figures in South Africa, from entities like the NPA, the National Treasury, and the FIC went to Paris, I think it was, to present their case and fight our corner. We were sat very nervously waiting. We were effectively writing our exam, we're defending our doctorate, and we're hoping it was enough. Was what we were writing and what we were saying enough? Was it enough to avoid that greylisting? Quick sip of water, apologies. I think we know the answer to that one, though. In the words of Lemony Snicket, words were not enough. What we were showing really was a lot of activity, a lot of intention, perhaps not as much implementation or on-the-ground effectiveness, and the FATF saw this. They noted that while South Africa has made significant progress on many of the recommendations to improve its AML-CFT systems, especially around policies and amending legal frameworks, we had missed the pass mark, and we'd received that now infamous greylisting designation. And Chris Milan, our friend at the FICA, said only last week in a session I was in with him, our reputation is in tatters and we need to restore it. But he went on to say that our efforts shouldn't be action to just shake off greylist designation, but this is an opportunity, an impetus to change, to do things better. And I agree, as challenging as greylist designations are, I hope this is enough to drive real, tangible, as the FATF said, sustained change. Because we know the FATF expectations, but what do we actually have to do as a country to get it out of the grey? We're sitting with a complex set of issues in a country with complex structures and complex history. But we're also now firmly on the global stage, and we need to work together to pull off this performance of a lifetime. So we'll quickly break down the findings into action points and look at what has to happen, but also who we're relying on to deliver those changes. And you'll see it crosses public and private sector. So the first is that work by CIPC, the Master's Office, and NGOs around beneficial ownership. The use of legal people to hide or provide a level of legitimacy or cover transactions. I'm sure we've all heard recent corruption cases where companies owned by individuals have been used to ferry assets and hide assets while trying to minimize attention or link to who's actually behind it. For example, you can think about Digital Vibe, which was funds intended for COVID-related communications, allegedly went astray through a sea of companies. Similarly, we've seen assets bought and titled in the name of legal persons or friends or family of politically exposed prominent people, allegedly sought from irregularly awarded tenders. I'm treading lightly there because we've not seen the prosecutions yet. The key requirement of FATF to ensure that we have access to timely, accurate, up-to-date, beneficial ownership information on all legal persons. To do that, we need registers that have to have information in that's been identified and verified and is accurate. Really just so that legal persons such as charities and companies can't be used to hide behind. So we have the law, it's in the General Law Amendment. We just don't actually have those registration or registers yet. But I know there is a scurry of activity behind the scenes developing systems to try and get those live as quickly as we can. But if we look back at the numerous investigations and arrests, while cases take a long time to put together, who have we actually seen successfully prosecuted yet? And that leads to our next point around law enforcement. And this point seems more systemic. Chris Milan also mentioned last week that there are a number of institutional challenges around prosecution and asset forfeiture involving a wide range of institutions that's impacting our ability to actively prosecute effectively. If we explore that, perhaps the first challenge is a lack of capacity and efficiency. There's not enough staff on the ground to effectively take on the workload. There's not enough supporting systems, not enough supporting processes in place to help them. That could be followed by a lack of capability and effectiveness, a lack of resources with the right skills in the right role, and arguably perhaps with the right impetus. It was clear from the review that the focus has been very often on easier to solve and close cases rather than the more complex investigations like money laundering. Whether that's from a lack of ability or a desire to hit targets is very much up for discussion. Targets and reports are great, but only if they measure the right things. So I think frustration around this has led to many staff leaving those institutions at an arguably critical time and taking up rather positions in the private sector. And that's continuing to compound the issues that are being experienced. There is deep challenge throughout the value chain from suspicion to prosecution. And I think it's something that all parties in the process are going to have to address and to be able to demonstrate as effective and working. So we really have to watch this space to see if we can improve our entire system from identification of crime through that whole due process. And I think it's something the entire country is waiting with bated breath to actually see. I'm tempted to put champagne on ice for that first prosecution. But that leads on to then work needed by the FEIC. The FEIC needed to improve its sharing of information, both in response to requests from other law enforcement agencies to support them, but also proactively, and not just domestically, internationally, providing accurate, timely, relevant, useful information to support that prosecution and asset forfeiture that I think we're all so desperate to see. Part of that drive for better, more efficient information was that broadening of sectors of accountable institutions. Having that broader base of information provides breadth, and the better they are then to identify illicit activities, follow the flow of funds, identify trends, typologies, and support the authorities in ultimately prosecuting the culprit. The next theme is around that terrorist finance related stuff, the activities and the funding. We know a key requirement of speaker is to screen customers against the targeted financial systems list, sanctions list rather, which is based on United Nations 1267 list, and it really looks to address terrorist related funding and support. But there's a lack of confidence that this is actually happening on the ground. And I've got to say, from something my teams and I think we see every day, is that we're not always seeing institutions screening against these lists, and speaker begins and ends for them an ID book and a proof of address. But an interesting related requirement is the FATF to understand the terrorism and proliferation of related risk in the country, not just place reliance on the United Nations list. They need to actively identify domestic names. And the FATF specifically said, South Africa has failed to demonstrate that it is effectively identifying, investigating or prosecuting terrorist financiers or addressing terrorism financing through various measures. But again, that needs effective investigation and policing, which we've already covered, has extensive challenges. But I think there is a general lack of awareness in the country. For example, in November last year, the US Treasury imposed sanctions on a South African-based national, Nufail Akbar, Yunus Mohammed Akbar, and Umar Akbar, and all of the related that those people were, all the entities that those people were related to. It said that they were members of a Durban Islamic State cell operating in South Africa, who had been proven to provide technical, financial, and material support to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The US also sanctioned a chap called Farhad Huma and 3 others in March for very similar offences. Now, South Africa, the authorities arrested Huma, Akbar, and 10 others back in 2018 for planting incendiary devices, bombs at a Shia mosque in Verulam, and shops and a horse racing in Durban. And they were also charged, this cell were charged with murdering a worshipper, stabbing an imam, and kidnapping a Tanzanian resident. The case was thrown out of court, according to the Institute of Security Studies, because of prosecution deficiencies. And it seems unlikely that a case can be reinstated. But this isn't sadly a one-off example. South Africa's failure to deal effectively with IS and terrorist financing has a host of causes. They could include problems with intelligence detection, prosecution, but I think the systemic nature of those challenges is probably topic for an entire other webinar series. But these issues are also aggregated through political factors like this ideological disposition to underestimate the terror threat in the country. And the FATF report alluded to that, and it said South Africa's reluctance to classify politically motivated violent acts as terrorism is constraining their ability to tackle the problem. So we need to take control of counter-terrorism as well, to restore international and domestic confidence, and determined and concerted action is needed by all government agencies. And I think that's a practical element that the FATF will want to see. Finally, is that element of effective supervision. The report highlighted a need to improve supervision and to find people where they're finding non-compliance. And this commitment has been reiterated already by regulatory supervisory bodies. We have 3 peaks in South Africa, the FSCA, the FIC, and the SARB, and they all very quickly issued press releases after the announcement of our grey listing. The FSCA is the market conduct regulator for financial institutions, but it also supervises financial service providers, FSPs like asset managers, collective investment schemes. So it plays a vital role in safeguarding the integrity of that interconnected financial system. The FSCA Commissioner, Unati Kamlana, said that the things that pertain to their mandate that the FSCA have largely been attended to, and they are satisfied that systems and processes are rigorous enough to monitor local players as required by FATF, but they did reiterate a commitment that will continue to pull together and address any gaps that might still exist in their value chain. Great word, but again, we need to see those inspections, we need to see the sanctions for non-compliance. The SARB released a similar statement, acknowledging that the FATF, that the PA, the Prudential Authority, had made the most progress in terms of that risk-based approach of supervision. But again, the SARB also said it will further strengthen its supervision, further enhance the persuasiveness, and increase the proportionality of sanctions that are being issued. And they state they have a zero tolerance approach when addressing the abuse of the financial system by money launderers or terrorist financiers. The FIC, interestingly, reposted a media release from the National Treasury with nothing too specific around their views. And I find that interesting, bearing in mind they're shortly going to be responsible for an additional 55,000 entities to supervise. But either way, it's clear that there has been a very public acknowledgement of the roles and responsibilities and a commitment to doing what is right, not just what is easy. So we need to now put these words into demonstrable, I can't say that word, demonstrated action, and we've got now until 2025, January, to prove our mettle. So we've covered the big hitters, the law enforcement, the regulators, the supervisory bodies, and a lot of the points we've mentioned are systemic. But what does it mean for people in institutions on the front line? The accountable institutions, do they have a role to play? Absolutely, a resounding yes. A common theme we've talking about, a thread running through the session, is one of action, of demonstrating effectiveness, the implementation on the ground. And a large part of that will come from accountable institutions, old and new. We have to make better use of information, of intelligence, and that information comes from accountable institutions' suspicious report. There is a clear statement from the FSCA that's after FIC that supervision will increase, as will the consequences for non-compliance. We need to use and evidence that on the ground legislation is being put into action. So how can accountable institutions help fight this grey listing? Very simple. You just need to be compliant. And on that note, over the years, I think I've seen far too many firms and individuals engage in that willful blindness, in not asking the questions because they don't want to hear the answers, because they know what the answers are going to be. You know, where did the money come from? I can't hear you. Or putting business and profit over the opportunity to make a wider difference, to take a stand on protecting our environment, our wildlife, an impact on breaking a drug cartel, a human trafficking ring, counterfeit gangs by not enabling their financial flows. And these things are happening around us in South Africa. Perhaps it's also a matter of fighting the culture of what is easy, the hear no evil, see no evil, the option that benefits the individual. Through the recent stories around corruption and fraud, where public funds are allegedly being misdirected in their literal billions to benefit the few, it's difficult to argue what difference it would make, but we have to start somewhere and we all have to play our part. And I think there's not just a legislative compliance here, it's not just a systemic issue, but a mindset and a cultural change, a complete paradigm shift across the country from top to bottom. We need to collectively say that enough is enough, and take a leaf from the silence of the Three Musketeers and say it's one for all, not as much as possible for one. I read a closing webinar, or closing to a webinar a few years ago, and I use it a lot on our training courses, so some of you might have heard me say it, but I think it speaks to how every person can make a difference. Money laundering is by design a subterranean crime. It's deliberately difficult to detect and to prosecute, but we can all make a difference. Regulations can seem like a burden, but it does seem, as we've seen today, it does serve a real purpose, and complying can become part of your day-to-day with the right tools and processes. And even just asking yourself, does what in front of me make sense at every interaction? Pick up something untoward. The true financial crime superheroes, in my mind, are the people on the front line, involved with the clients, the assets, the transactions, who use their skills, experience, and knowledge to pick up on these subtle cues that something untoward might be going on. You really can be part of making a difference, of getting the colour back into our amazing country, and finally moving out from under that grey listing designation cloud that's hanging over us. You really are part of the frontline defence against money laundering, terrorist financing in South Africa. And I think by actively engaging, you can play your part in turning grey listing around. So in advance, I say thank you